Well, welcome to the last of the lectures on the poetry portion of this course. This week we're going to cover the mind. I know, it's a terrible thing to waste. And that'll probably be the last and weakest of the jokes that you hear from me. Most of what I say in today's lecture is going to attend to things we've already discussed, but perhaps with a little bit of a different spin. I'm going to be addressing most of the nuts and bolts that we've already dealt with and talking about them in terms of form and structure. I'm also going to talk about revision, and it makes sense that we'll end the sequence with a discussion of revision. Mostly, however, we're going to be presenting this week arguments about form and structure and how they work, why they work, how much sense they make, and what kinds of sense it is we're talking about in poetry. I've said to you a number of times already that ultimately the things that you choose to do in your poems, the techniques and strategies you apply, need to make poetic sense. And maybe you know what that means by now, maybe you're not sure, or maybe you have no idea, but we're going to try to unpack that phrase. So we'll be addressing issues of an intellectual nature, what the role of logic and what the role of nonsense are in poetry and how they come into play. But we begin with structure, and structure in terms of our language begins with sentences. It is the basic unit of meaning in our language. In terms of how we use them in poetry, you've got to remember, first of all, that sentences and lines are not equivalent, or not necessarily equivalent. A line of poetry can be as long or as small as you want it to be. A sentence has strict rules that it follows. You can have one-line sentences, you can have 100-line sentences. So in part, we're continuing a conversation that I started last week with you about the difference between the structure of what you're saying and how sensible it is grammatically, if you will, and then how it is presented, which can be very different in terms of the form or the format of the poem. Longer sentences, simpler sentences tend to move more slowly, more smoothly, and convey that sense. On the other hand, shorter sentences are more complex, more choppy structures, more convoluted structures, tend to create a sense of difficulty or excitement or turbulence or complexity. I want to begin with a poem called A Blasphemy by Rodney Jones. It's in your textbooks on page 546, but it represents a very interesting instance of a sentence at work in the poem. I'm going to read it in its entirety first and then talk for a minute about it. A girl attacked me once with a No. 2 Eagle pencil for a whiny, lisping impression of a radio preacher she must have loved more than sophistication or peace. For she took the pencil in a whitened knuckle and drove the point with all her weight behind it through a thick pair of jeans, jogging it at the end and twisting it so the lead broke off under the skin. An act undertaken so suddenly and dramatically it was thought I had awakened in a strange hotel with sirens going off and half-dressed women rushing in every direction with kids tucked under their arms, as though the Muslims had retaken Jerusalem for the 12th time, the Crusaders were riding south, and the Jews in Cadiz and Granada were packing their bags, mapping the snowy ghettos of the north. But where we were, it was still Tuscaloosa, late summer, and the heat in her sparsely decorated room we had come to together after work was so miserable and intense the wallpaper was crimping at each seam. The posters of daisies and horses she had pasted up were falling all over the floor. Whatever I thought would happen was not going to happen. Nothing was going to happen with any of the 3 billion women of the world forever. The time it would take for the first kindness was the wait for a Campbellite to accept Darwin and Galileo, or for all Arkansas to embrace the Black Messiah. The time it would take for even a hand to shyly, unambiguously brush my own was the years Bertrand Russell waited for humanism, disarmament, and neutrality. And then she was there, her cloth daubing at the darkly gelling wound. In contrition, she bowed with tweezers to pick the grit. With alcohol, she cleansed the rubbery petals. She unspooled the white gauze and spread the balm of mercy. Because she loved Christ, she forgave me. And what was that all about? I wondered, walking home through the familiar streets, the steeple of each church raised like a beneficent weapon, the mark of the heretic on my thigh, and mockery was still the unforgivable sin. Now, I love the poem, but I want to point you to the very first sentence, okay? It captures 15 lines of the poem. The first line, it begins with, "A girl attacked me once," and it does not end until we get all the way down to the snowy ghettos of the north. You can read this yourself. Hopefully you've paused and read along. 15 lines, 15 line breaks, end punctuation, non-punctuation, a number of phrases. There's a serious escalation between lines 7, after line 7, all the way down to the middle of the 13th line, in which there's no punctuation at all, except for one semicolon, and it creates a sense of the rambling, perhaps the movement of the character's mind after he had been stabbed. At least you could create an argument for it. So pay attention to the way that sentences are constructed, to the way that you construct your own, and remember that you're not at all limited by the line in terms of the sentences you present. They have nothing to do with one another, really, though they may coincide. You may choose to have them coincide. There's no definite rule or cause that forces that to happen. Now, different sentences and clauses are related in different ways, and within a poem you have a number of choices in terms of how you connect them for effect. And again, each device or each technique creates a certain effect that you should be considering. Right? We don't use literary techniques or poetic devices for their own sake. We only use them to support what we're trying to accomplish in the poem. We have connectives, words like and, coordinating conjunctions that their only job is literally to connect other words together. And when we use a series of connectives in between other words, one of the effects is a sort of dragging, a boredom that's caused. Another, which is more represented in Seamus Heaney's The Death of a Naturalist, which I'm going to read in just a second, creates a sort of dreamy, childlike sort of tone. And that's more what we hear in this one. Now listen to this poem, and then I'll return to the idea that it's conveying. Death of a Naturalist. All year the flax stem festered in the heart of the townland. Green and heavy-headed flax had rotted there, weighted down by huge sods. Daily it sweltered in the punishing sun. Bubbles gargled delicately. Bluebottles wove a strong gauze of sound around the smell. There were dragonflies, spotted butterflies, but best of all was the warm, thick slobber of frog spawn that grew like clotted water in the shades of the banks. Here, every spring, I would fill jam potfuls of the jellied specks to range on the windowsills at home, on shelves at school, and wait and watch until the fattening dots burst into nimble swimming tadpoles. Miss Walls would tell us how the daddy frog was called a bullfrog, and how he croaked, and how the mammy frog laid hundreds of little eggs, and this was frog spawn. You could tell the weather by frogs, too, for they were yellow in the sun and brown in the rain. Then one hot day, when the fields were rank with cow dung in the grass, the angry frogs invaded the flax stem. I ducked through the hedges to a coarse croaking that I had not heard before. The air was thick with a bass chorus. Right down the dam, gross-bellied frogs were cocked on sods. Their loose necks pulsed like sails. Some hopped. The slap and plop were obscene threats. Some sat poised like mud grenades, their blunt heads farting. I sickened, turned, and ran. The grape slime kings were gathered there for vengeance, and I knew that if I dipped my hand, the spawn would clutch it. Kind of weird. Kind of nasty poem, I guess. But I want to draw your attention to line 15. We begin with Miss Walls, and the tone of this particular line as it employs connectives. Miss Walls would tell us how the daddy frog was called a bullfrog, and how he croaked, and how the mammy frog laid hundreds of little eggs, and this was frog spawn. We get the sense of a child telling a story. This is what they do, and this, and that, and then, and then, and then. And it works in this case. But like I said, this is not the only mechanism or the only consequence of this mechanism, we can turn it in a different direction, slow things down, drag things out by continuously repeating "and" in a different context. Parataxis, on the other hand, is the omission of connectives, literally the setting side by side of things. And this can create a different effect. It's rougher, more jagged, tends to be more surreal in sound. Things are not connected, or at least not clearly connected. So the effect is usually one that you would want to produce if you have a situation in a text where there's tension or confusion or awkwardness for whatever reason, or perhaps if you want to create some sort of dreamlike state. Now, Suzanne Loomis in Morning After the 6.1 presents us a sense of what it must have been like immediately following a 6.1 earthquake. And here's her use of parataxis in this poem. At work we tell, and tell of disasters, wrack of flood tides, wind chill, uncontained fires, eye of storm, core of volcano. Remember the Silmar when the ground pinched like the deck of a ship, the power lines jerked and snapped, electricity bolted into the dark like unspeakable languages. We are too happy to work. Survival has gone to our heads like pirate rum. Dead, stand back and make way. We are the living. Now, the beginning of the poem is where the parataxis really produces a strong effect, as we have a sequence or series of images that are not immediately connectable by the mind. And this sort of makes the kind of sense we're talking about here. When you've got confusion, how do you convey that to someone in a poem? And you have a number of tools you can use with which to convey this, and plenty of other senses or emotions in a poem, not necessarily emotions, but certainly they're part of it, just by the way that you put your words together. Now, there are a number of other variations in terms of sentence structure that I'm going to talk about fairly quickly, so I'd ask you to stop me and ask questions and raise your hands if you don't get it, but well, that's not going to work here in the video world, so I'll try to be as clear as I can. Sentence structure includes these aspects. Parallelism, which essentially is constructing lines using a parallel structure. In other words, if you have, say, a subject-verb-object structure as the basis for your sentence, repeating that multiple times in subsequent sentences would be parallelism. Page 277 of your book presents a fine example of parallelism in I Hear America Sing by Whitman. Lines 3 and 4. The carpenter singing his, and he measured his plank on beam. The mason singing his, as he makes ready for work, or leaves off work. Each line begins with the basic same structure, subject, verb, and then object. This is parallelism. It can be used as much or as little as you like in a poem. It creates a sense of comfort, similar to the way that rhyme works. Anaphora is a variation of parallelism in which not just the structure is repeated, but the actual words are repeated. At the bottom of page 277, we hear an example of this. For want of a nail, the shoe was lost. For want of a shoe, the horse was lost. For want of a horse, the rider was lost. For want of a rider, the battle was lost. And on it goes. The repeating of for want is the anaphora in the poem. Similar to anaphora, epistrophe is the repetition of words at the end of a line. So if you have that parallel, you've got what's called epistrophe. Further, we have a different way of connecting texts using a structure called chiasmus, in which the structure is parallel but essentially reversed, like these two lines. I like football, baseball I hate. Like football, baseball I hate. Okay, here we've inverted the structure. We've essentially crossed them. Another variation of this parallelism is called antithesis. And antithesis employs not a crossing of the structure. The structure remains intact, but rather a crossing of the idea, so that ultimately perhaps we have a sort of ironic sense that's conveyed, but the antithesis presents an antagonism or a contrasting of ideas set aside to one another. Whitman's verse illustrates this very well. I am of old and young, of the foolish as much as the wise, regardless of others, ever regardful of others. Okay, here we have structure the same, but idea differing, set side by side. This is antithesis. Now, there are other variations of sentence structure which can occur to good or to not so good use. We've talked about one of them before, inversion. And inversion essentially is putting words out of order, putting arguably the wrong words first and the right words out of place after them. Now, inversions can be used effectively. We have the poem, and I think I've mentioned this before, Me Up It Does by E.E. Cummings, which is a brilliant use of inversion. Me up it does, out of the floor, quietly stare a poisoned mouse, still, who alive is asking, what have I done that you wouldn't have? Now, this is as good a use of inversion properly as I can see. You're not using it to sound poetic. Rather, it doesn't sound at all poetic. It sounds confused, and that makes sense given the concern of the poem. In the scene where a mouse that's been poisoned is staring up at the poisoner is taken aback and arguably would be somewhat distressed by this encounter. The thoughts are jumbled in the poisoner's mind. At least that's what we see represented here. Interestingly enough, at the end of the poem, where we see what the poisoner assumes the mouse to be saying, there's perfect clarity and no inversions. What have I done that you wouldn't have? Interesting enough, huh? Now, parenthesis is another variation of sentence structure in which we have a break away from the original train of thought. Now, parenthesis normally implies that we're using parentheses, parenthetical marks, but we can also use dashes. Parenthesis means more, not what mark of punctuation you use, but simply that the interruption of the thought being presented is still on the same line of reasoning. So it is related or concerned with the initial thought. Your book provides you with an excerpt from Shakespeare's Cymbeline on page 280, which represents very well effective use of parentheses. It has dashes and it has parentheses, but more importantly, what we see here is these asides being thrown in to disrupt the flow of what would be a normal, simple thinking process. Upon a time, oh, by the way, before I go any further, you should probably have your books open and be reading along as you listen to the lecture so that you get more of what I'm saying. You don't just hear it, you can see it as well. Back to Cymbeline. Upon a time, unhappy was the clock that struck the hour. It was in Rome, accursed the mansion where 'twas at a feast. Oh, would our viands had been poisoned, or at least those which I have heaved to head. The good Posthumus, what should I say? Now, we start with upon a time, and then a reference aside to a clock. Then in Rome, and the reference to the location of a house inside Rome. And at a feast, and then a discussion about being poisoned. These are stretches, but they are related stretches, digressions, I should say, if you will, of the original line of thought. And certainly we get a sense of the distractedness of the speaker, which is appropriate given the difficulty of his condition. Now, anakaluthon is another variation of sentence structure, and this one is similar to parenthesis, except that the interruption is a digression in a direction that is irrelevant to the initial discussion. Okay, we have this example in To Helen of Troy, in which the speaker is in love. Now, we all know how distracted we can get when we're in love, so you should be able to understand what's going on here. I'll just read the first stanza. I sit here with the wind is in my hair. I huddled like the sun is in my eyes. I wished you'd contacted me alone. Here we have a parenthesis surrounding in the third line, I wished you'd contact me, which is completely separate from this person speaking of his own state. We've also got a couple of other problems here, grammatical digressions, if you will. I sit here with the wind is in my hair. Grammatically, that's problematic. There's a break in the logic. They don't follow one another. Okay, I sit here with, you could say, with the wind, but also you could say the wind is in my hair. We don't know essentially where the article fits or where the first thought ends and the second begins. This confusion, this lack of sensible following of two separate ideas combined is anakalutha. One more variation of sentence structure that can be interesting is aposiopesis, which is falling silent. Now, this often happens when you're upset or frustrated and don't know where to go next. I almost did it there in case you hadn't noticed. You don't know where to go next with the middle of your thought. Yeats is an example here. Hanrahan rose in a frenzy there and followed up those baying creatures towards, I've forgotten what, enough. Yeats cannot finish his idea. Robert Frost in Beyond Words, very simple variation. That row of icicles along the gutter feels like my armory of hate, and you utter, you wait. Here, there's a complete shift. The idea that's presented stops altogether. It's consumed by emotion in this case, and ends before it's spoken. The next issue of structure we have to address is what I call word sense, or what we might talk about is the structure of words themselves. Now, we've got our standard words, that our vocabulary that we have from the dictionary and from wherever else, that are the words we know. But in poetry, especially now that you've got your poetic licenses, or almost got them, maybe you have your permits, you can start bending these words, playing with them. There are the elements of portmanteau, there are the elements of word blending and hyphenated language, where you are taking two words and combining them into one to create hopefully a meaning that is greater than the sum of the parts. Portmanteau is an example of sort of creative word blending where what you end up with is not really resembling either of the two words that you combine, or however many you combine, but rather something that sort of echoes them. The word blends began 1,000 years ago or more with poems as old as Beowulf, in which one word and another were put together in order to make some sort of sense that went beyond what was originally there in the two. We have the examples from Lewis Carroll's Jabberwocky of chortle and galumph. Now, chortle is not a word, but we kind of get a sense of it. It's a combination of the word chuckle and snort, and that's kind of what it sounds like. And galumph, gallop, triumph. I'm not sure that one sounds so triumphant. Maybe it's not a great example. But the next one is, as Mark Doty writes about an old dog, an old spaniel. He says, when he falls and looked up from those droozed ancient eyes. Droozed is not a word. It never was, as far as I know. But if you take droopy and you take oozing, you might end up with droozed. Did you get that sort of sense from that word, if you will? I hope you did. It kind of makes sense in a peculiar sort of way. And this is what we're talking about when we talk about portmanteau. Word blends and hyphenated words that are made up go back as far as Beowulf, as far as English poetry goes back. E. Cummings' Whirlings and Wendlings represents a couple of word blends that are much more recent and just as effective as the original ones. Whirlings and Wendlings themselves are sorts of word blends, providing the ling ending to words that normally they wouldn't apply to. But we have examples such as moon's whisper, why-colored, sun smell, which are blended words that seem to impart a different sort of meaning than their original sounds. Why-colored doesn't make sense at all, but one might wonder about its value. Sun smell, as opposed to sun's smell, carries a smoothness with it that one could argue imparts more significance. The next part of this lecture has to do with form, and essentially it is an argument for the imparting of form upon poetry, and it's a reasonable argument I'm going to make here by using nature and by using logic to illustrate the value of form. Especially, I think this is important because most of you prefer not to write with form. Some of you are quite good with it, and some of you are quite comfortable with it. Others of you, I think, likely tend toward preferring not to be restricted by a pattern or a form. But I'm going to make this argument to you. Forms and patterns appear everywhere. They exist in nature on a level beyond which we even notice. If you think of, for example, the waves in the ocean, you think of the rising and setting sun. These are patterns. These are patterns. The rotation of the earth, the rotation of the turning of the earth around the sun, and the moon around the earth, and blah, 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 blah. There are patterns everywhere in nature. Now, the Fibonacci sequence, which your book talks about, is one of the most significant and recurring forms that we see in nature, in places that we are astounded by. We see the Fibonacci sequence, first of all, essentially identifies a sequence of numbers for which the first number plus the second number leads to the third. The second plus the third leads to the fourth. 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, etc. And this sequence creates what's called the golden ratio of 0.618 to 1. Now, mathematically, this is significant because the ratio created sequentially allows for this structure. The first part is related to the second part, as the second part is related to the whole of the object. I'm not going to try to explain to you using words what is much more clearly represented visually by line segments and patterns of rectangles and squares in your textbook. But what I will say is that what's important for us to think about is the idea of the patterns in and of themselves and how they're occurring in nature. These are very, very precise patterns, and we see them in waves, we see them in flowers, we see them in the seashells, the nautilus shells, we see them in growth patterns and reproductive patterns. We see them in the human body. One example is that the length of the body from the head to the belly button and from the belly button to the bottom of the feet represents this ratio. Even further fragmenting the length of the body from the belly button to the throat and from the throat to the head again represents this ratio, just as from the center to the knees and from the knees to the toes also represents this ratio of 0.618 to 1. So it occurs everywhere, more places I'm sure than we've noticed, but the point is very simple. Okay, these patterns are natural. So to say that we want to write poetry and we want it to flow naturally does not imply, at least not honestly, that there can be no fixed form, because these rigid structures and fixed forms appear everywhere in nature. So this is the argument that patterns should occur in poetry, that there is sense to this pattern, that there is nature to this pattern. Whatever pattern it is we choose. And next I want to talk about a few of these different kinds of patterns. Essentially, we've got a couple of different forms. We've got fixed forms, and then we've got forms that are constructed out of other parts. And we'll talk first about the parts available. Stanzas are the primary building block of poetic form. All right. Now, stanzas shouldn't be confused with paragraphs, and if you think about a verse paragraph, that essentially means any block of text separated from any other block of text by a space or break. But a stanza is a very specific kind of paragraph form because it's a pattern that's constructed which is then repeated exactly or nearly exactly continuously throughout a poem. So the difference between the stanza and the paragraph in poetry is that stanzas are continuous. Okay, one stanza ends and the next stanza begins, and these things resemble one another very, very closely. Their names are simple enough. They essentially are contrived based on the rhyme scheme, the number of lines, and the meter of those lines. That's how they're built, and that's how they're named. We have tercets, which essentially is a three-line stanza with a repeating pattern of rhyme. The pattern can take on a number of forms. It could be AAA, it could be ABA, it could be ABB. It doesn't really matter as long as the pattern is repeated. Now we have a special kind of tercet, which is called terzarima. And in terzarima, what we have is these tercets linked. Okay, linked triplets using the rhyme scheme to link them. So we have ABA in stanza 1, BCB in stanza 2. And on that goes. Next is the quatrain, defined by the number 4. 4 lines is a quatrain, and there are a number of different stanza forms and different rhyming patterns. Rarest of all is the monorhyme, AAAA. All right, normally ABAB or ABBA are seen more often, but that again doesn't matter so much as long as the form or the pattern is repeated from one quatrain to the next. Now, there is specifically what's called a ballad stanza, which is a series of quatrains in which each quatrain contains alternating 4 and 3 foot lines. Okay, so the first line would be 4 beats or 4 feet, metrical feet, remember that from last time, and the next line would be 3, and the third line would be 4, and the fourth line would be 3, and the rhyme scheme would be ABAB, so that the A rhymes, the A lines would have 4 beats, and the B lines would have 3. Now, there's also a 5-line stanza, which doesn't have a dominant form in particular and doesn't actually get used to the point where it's got itself a name. I suppose you could call it a pentet, but that's not really been done. So normally speaking, the 5-line stanza is a combination of a couplet and a triplet or something to that effect, where your rhyme scheme could be anything from all A's to ABAAB, ABBAB. It doesn't really matter. Nothing is taken precedence in terms of 5-line stanzas. Next is the sestet, which is 6 lines. Okay, whatever you want in terms of a structure, as long as it has 6 lines and is repeated, is called a sestet. Now there are a couple of significant sestet forms. First is the Venus and Adonis stanza, which is a quatrain and a couplet rhyming ABAB, and then the couplet CC within one stanza. And then there's the Scottish stanza, which is a little bit more precise. It contains a rhyme scheme of AAA, BAB, 6 lines. The A lines are in tetrameter, and the B lines are in dimeter. So we have 4 feet in the lines that end with the A rhyme, and 2 feet in the lines that end with the B rhyme. They're much shorter, half the length. Now we have octaves, which are 8-line stanzas, and the most dominant of this is ottava rima, okay, 8 rhyme, literally, or translated. And this form takes the structure of A, B, A, B, A, B, C, C. So again, we have a couplet at the end of the octave, but like I said, that's the form. Now, 9-line stanza, the only one that really took any sort of precedence at all, or any sort of forefront at all, is the Spenserian stanza used in The Faerie Queene, which is a very famous and very long poem. This was structured as follows: A, B, A, B, B, C, B, C, C. All iambic, 8 lines of tetrameter, and 1 Alexandrine, which is 10 beats. All right. Now, in addition to these stanza structures, or stanza forms, in which you can do anything you want for as long as you want, there are what are called fixed forms, okay, specific complete poem forms. And I'm sure you're familiar with some of them, like the sonnet, for example. The sonnet form has 2 basic rules: 14 lines, iambic pentameter. Those are the rules. Okay. Now, there are a couple of different kinds of sonnet forms that you're probably familiar with: the Italian or the Petrarchan sonnet, which is structured in 2 parts. It's got an octave and a sestet. The octave rhymes ABBA, ABBA, and then the sestet, while there are variations, uses 2 or 3 rhymes repeating, either BCE, BCE, CDE, CDE, or CD, 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 and you can do whatever you want with the rhyming in the sestet. Normally speaking, beyond the structure or the form of these poems, they tend to be celestial or romantic, sort of overblown. Now, an alternative to the Italian or the Petrarchan sonnet is the Shakespearean or English sonnet, which is a little bit different. It's 3 quatrains and a couplet. And sometimes they're broken up with spaces, and sometimes they're not. Sometimes the couplet is indented. The rhyme scheme is as follows: A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, and then G, G is the rhyming couplet at the end. Okay, and the Shakespearean sonnets took on a range of themes. They weren't so restricted as the Petrarchan sonnets. Then there's the sestina, and the sestina is a series of sestets followed by a 3-line envoy or a short outro or conclusion. The key to the structure of the sestina is that in the first sestet, each line ends with a particular word, and in each subsequent stanza, those 6 end words are repeated as end words in the stanza, not necessarily in the same locations. So essentially, you've got a rhyme scheme of A, B, C, D, E, F that repeats itself out of order more often than not in every other stanza: A, B, C, D, E, F, or perhaps A, C, D, B, F, E in the following stanza. The key is that those 6 words are the only words that can end the lines. And normally speaking, you have 6 of those sestets, which gives each word a turn in one location in the stanza. And then in your envoy, in your 3-line envoy, you use 3 of those words to end the lines, and 3 of them need to be applied internally in the midline. All right, and that's a sestina. It's a very difficult, very complicated form in terms of how do I take 6 words and make them go into exactly these particular places and retain grammatical correctness and meter at the same time. All of these forms actually are quite difficult because they force you to do a little bit of gymnastics with your grammar in order to be able to locate things where they need to be located. Now, there's play with repetition, which is one structural concern of the forms, and we have a number of different fixed forms that play with repetition. The ballade, which is 3 octave stanzas of A, B, A, B, B, C, B, C, followed by a quatrain of B, C, A, C, and the only hook in the ballade is that the last line C has to be repeated at the end of each stanza and the refrain. All right? Now there's also what's called the acrostic, in which essentially the first letter of each line is used to build some sort of vertical phrasing or vertical sense. If you were to read down the first letter of each line of the poem, there would be some sort of name or message or thing identified by reading vertically. The next fixed form that plays with repetition is the villanelle. It's a 19-line poem that has tercets for stanzas and is completed with a quatrain at the very end. The rhyme scheme for the poem is ABA, and all of the stanzas are ABA. It doesn't go ABA, BCB. It continues with ABA, and the quatrain is ABAB. Now, the tricky part about this is that not only do we have these end rhymes of A and B, we also have repetition of lines, so that the very first line of the poem and the third line are repeated, and they repeat as the last line of each subsequent stanza alternating. So it might be easier for me just to point you to Dylan Thomas's "Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night" than it would be to explain it to you. You might want to check out that poem again. We've talked about it before, but essentially the first line, "Do not go gentle into that good night," is the last line of the second stanza and the last line of the fourth stanza. And "Rage, rage against the dying of the light," which is the third line of the first stanza, is also the last line of the third stanza, the last line of the fifth stanza. And then at the very end of the poem, these two lines, the first and third lines of the poem, come together to form a final couplet in the quatrain at the very end. So it's a pretty rigidly fixed form, and the difficulty in working with such a form is to make it sound unfixed, to make it sound like natural speech, despite the fact that in 19 lines we only have 2 sounds repeated over and over and over again, and in fact we have entire lines repeated quite frequently. But if the poem's done well, again, we don't hear the repetition as imposed upon the text. Rather, it just sort of occurs, and we read it naturally, and it makes natural sense. But further, the other repetition play form is called the pantoum, and the pantoum is made up of rhyming quatrains, ABAB, BCBC, etc., etc., etc. But not only do these quatrains rhyme, the second and fourth lines of each quatrain are the first and third lines of the next quatrain. So essentially you're using every line of your poem twice, once as the even numbers in a quatrain and then as the odd numbers in the following quatrain. And this really has the way of tightening the poem up with that repetition. There are other variations of play. There's syllable play, and you're familiar with one, which is the haiku. It's a 17-syllable poem with the line structure as 5, 7, and then 5 syllables. Now, originally, the haiku evolved from what's called a tanka, which is a 31-syllable poem, 5, 7, 5, 7, 7. So there's a couplet, if you will, although the phrase couplet really applies to rhyme groups. But there's a group of 3 lines which begin the poem that eventually became just the haiku, and then 2 more lines following with 7 syllables as well. Now, an American form of something similar is called the cinquain, and this is a series of syllables 2, 4, 6, 8, and then 2. Okay? These forms take on no particular intonations other than that the haiku tends to be of natural subjects and suggestion and suggests the seasons, but even that is somewhat flexible in contemporary poetry. We write haiku about things other than nature and about things other than seasons, though that's the way the form originated. In addition to syllable play, we have some more fun kind of poetry. Light verse is what it's called. You're all familiar with the limerick, and I could break it down, and that breakdown would sound something like this. It's a 5-line poem. A, A, B, B, A is the rhyme scheme, and the A lines consist of a meter as follows. An iambic foot, followed by 2 anapestic foots, followed by an extra beat. There once was a man from Nantucket. You can figure that out from here. Okay? The B syllable lines are an iambic foot plus an anapestic foot. I'm not going to read the rest of the Nantucket poem. Besides, there are too many versions. They all end up in the same place. Additional variations of light verse, the Clarihue, which is a very small poem, basically 2 rhyming couplets that form a miniature biography. And then the Double Dactyl, which is a 2-verse poem, 2 quatrains, dominantly dactylic, except for the rhyming last line of each of the quatrains. The first line of the quatrain is generally a nonsense invocation, fiddle-dee-dee, fiddle-dee-dum, etc. The second line names the subject, William Shakespeare or whatever. And somewhere in this is the hook of the double dactyl, somewhere in the poem, one word which has the double dactylic form must be placed. And that can appear anywhere in the poem. And normally it's the 3rd or the 7th line, because those are the most open to opportunity. Otherwise, you've got restrictions in all the other lines. To finish the discussion about form, I think I need to identify for you what might be the point. Now, each form carries with it some sort of sense. And for many of the forms, the sense is form in itself. That perhaps we're drawing attention to an idea related to structure, or that something structured is actually the subject of the poem. For example, if you look at Thomas's "Do Not Go Gentle into That Good Night," because the poem is so rigidly structured, it resembles, or one could argue it resembles, the way that time marches and does not stop. Or you could argue that the repetition and recycling of the first and third lines illustrate the life cycle that is a part of the subject of the poem. You could argue that structures are patterns that appear in nature are the subjects of poems that would best employ poems of pattern, or that use pattern, or that have rigid forms. So there's a suggestion of sense in the fact of structure in and of itself, and then there are implications to certain kinds of structure. A very tight structure, for example, implies tension. A very rigid structure implies rigidity. You might think of soldiers marching. Okay? A war poem might make good use of that implication. A poem about the sea might make good use of the ups and downs of the rhythm and of the rhyme, because that's part of the message of the poem. Anyway, now, we've been talking much about the logic of poetry in the way it appears in form and structure, but there's also an unsense or an uncommon sense, or even a nonsense in poetry that needs to be talked about here. Most of the semester I've talked about the sense of poetry, or the sense of a poem, as something occurring above and beyond the theme. And this is essential because the theme of a poem is not necessarily the sense of the poem, not necessarily the most important element of a poem. I've discussed that poetic sense is made in a number of ways and a number of levels. The theme, the tone, the sound, the rhythm, the images of the poem all convey sense, and not necessarily, not identical sense, though they could be sense in the same neighborhood. And I've discussed that poetic sense is somewhat different than our common notion of sense, that it's not exactly the same as reality, or it's not the same as mathematical logic. Although one of the questions might be, how much does logic and mathematics, similar to the way we talked about patterns and forms, come into play in terms of making sense in a poem? Certainly we don't think of poetry as formulaic, or at least not good poetry. Perhaps Hallmark poetry is formulaic. It has rhymes, it has simple gestures, it has words that it has to key on. The emotion words, the ones I tell you that don't belong in poetry, this is part of the formula of greeting card poetry. Anyway, that doesn't mean that poetry is not sensible. It doesn't mean that poetry doesn't reflect reality so much. To a point, that's true. But it's also a little different than reality, and it reflects a different kind of reality, perhaps, or one that's a little bit less overt, less tangible. All right. The big issue of poetry is not so much what we use in a poem. Do we use logic? Do we use reason? Do we use form? Do we use pattern? But again, and this is something I've said since the beginning, it's a matter of balance and propriety, okay? The things that we do in a poem need to serve the purpose of the poem, whatever that purpose might be. Different genres of writing, for example, have different purposes, all right? The purpose of a poem is not to be ultimately logical, though it certainly might employ logic and logical structures. Many poems use logical forms, such as the list, the syllogism, which essentially is a if this, then that structure, and even numbering, even formulas. But overwhelming logic is more appropriate in an essay than it is in a poem. Just like narrative or storytelling is more appropriate in the genre of fiction writing or prose than it is in the genre of poetry. Although, again, it doesn't mean there are not narrative poems. I love to write story poems, narrative poems. But the story that it tells is not the only way that the poem works. And the story is, and again, we're going back to the origins of poetry in terms of talking about storytelling. So it's impossible to say that poems shouldn't tell stories. Of course they should. But rather, story is not the only function. Okay? And story is not the only sense that a poem makes. So while a poem certainly has a theme and can tell a story, it also works in different ways and on different levels. And the key is balance. That we don't want the logic to overpower the beauty, that we don't want the story to overpower the emotion, etc., etc., etc. Poetry, similar to fiction, has the luxury of bending reality somewhat. That even our language use, as I was showing you with the blends and the portmanteau words, even our language use gets bent a little bit. We can break forms and we can break structures. We can defy grammar and we can defy vocabulary rules in a poem if it makes the kind of sense that serves that poem best. We can defy reality as well. The kind of truth that we talk about in poetry is not that of fact and existence so much as a truth of being. It's a truth beyond logic. It's a truth of nonsense, perhaps. A truth that we can see and smell and hear and feel and perhaps know without thinking about. And if we think about it, we mess it up somehow. It's a truth that works in nonsense, in words that don't make sense. Our Bog is Dud by Stevie Smith on page 337 of your books is a terrific example of how things that don't make sense can convey poetic sense, and it probably does so in a way that almost no other poem I've read has, because it's impossible to know exactly what Smith is talking about, but yet we know exactly what she's talking about. Here we go. Our bog is Dud, our bog is Dud, they lisped in accents mild. But when I asked them to explain, they grew a little wild. How do you know your bog is Dud, my darling little child? We know because we wish it so, that is enough, they cried. And straight within each infant eye stood up the flame of pride, and if you do not think it so, you shall be crucified. Then tell me, darling little ones, what Dud suppose bog is? Just what we think, the answer came, just what we think it is. They bowed their heads, our bog is ours, and we are wholly his. But when they raised them up again, they had forgotten me. Each one upon each other glared in pride and misery, for what was Dud and what their bog, they never could agree. Oh, sweet it was to leave them then, and sweeter not to see, and sweetest of all to walk alone beside the encroaching sea, the sea that soon should drown them all, that never yet drowned me. Now here, if you go back and take some time, you can understand what this bog might be and what Dud might be. Bog is a word for God in some other languages, but it can work if you don't think of it as God, because the sense of the poem is not about the particular meaning of that word or those words so much as it is about a difference. And that difference can be conveyed regardless of specific meanings. So here I am throwing at you another convolution or apparent contradiction of some of the things that I've said to you earlier. For example, be specific, always specific. Your images are important. And in this case, the images are still important, but they are being conveyed in reference to something that is unknown. And in a way, if it is a poem talking about a god or a version of a god, perhaps best that it be left named but not understood. Anyway, the final aspect of this lecture has to do with revision. That's why it's last, because it should be the last thing you deal with. I'm going to talk a little bit about how poems emerge and evolve, and what happens to me when I write poems, but more importantly, how we can go about making poems better. We begin with inspiration. The inspiration of a poem is the seed of it. It can come from any one of a number of places. You've heard of the muse, I'm sure. Everyone has a different muse. For many of us, it's a love interest, or a location, or something of the sort, but there are plenty of others. A lot of us, and I think I do especially, tend to find inspiration in suffering, for some reason, the negative emotions. And I know some of you, as well, have admitted to connecting more strongly with the negative emotions in terms of your artistic inspiration. Regardless, where your inspiration comes from is of no matter here. Only that you have a source. But what's important to note is that as a poet or as a writer, your poems are not written on inspiration. They may begin that way, but they don't come out done purely based on inspiration. I'm going to argue that they never do, though you might think they do. Because at worst, if it comes out perfectly done, well, let's put it this way. If you believe in God, if you buy the God thing, then isn't assuming that the divine inspiration which has dropped this beautiful idea on you has connected to you directly? I suppose it's possible, depending on the quality of your faith, but it's not likely. Perhaps for those of you who are not believers in God, this might work even better. When's the last time that you can remember that you did something once and did it perfectly? Now, obviously, you've written more than one poem, but you've never written any one poem more than once, unless you revised it. So what makes you think that the way it comes out first is the best way it's going to come out? That's like saying, first of all, that, well, have you ever been in an argument with your spouse or your partner or your mate or whatever you want to call him or her, and said some things and then later thought to yourself that maybe you could have said them better or differently? Because if this has happened, this is very parallel to poetry. They come out great and they seem right in the moment. And you may think that you have done a perfect job of pleading your case or arguing your point or constructing your text or whatever it is you're doing. But I'd suggest you do this. Put it away for a year and then come back to it. And see if you still think it's perfect just the way it is. And if it is, maybe you have grabbed the brass ring, maybe you have found a golden cow, but I'm going to bet that you're going to look at it and say, I think this could be better now. Revision is essential. Now, how to revise, this is an issue of technique, not inspiration. Okay? And technique, essentially, is technical. It's employing the tools consciously. Sounds simple, precise, mathematical application of your skills to an issue or a problem to solve. All right? In poetry, this means finding the words, using the rhythms, the meters, the sounds that fit the idea, taking the tools you've learned here in the last 2 months and putting them to work to good end for yourself. Okay? And there are so many different starting points and ending points and choices you can make that it's impossible to cover them all here. Go at what you can. Use what you know. Do what feels right. Point to your weak spots. You can tell your weak spots usually, the things you know need fixing, and then go about them. But what I'll do here is I will forewarn about the danger of technique, that you can over-mechanicalize a poem. You can suck the life and the beauty and the sense right out of a poem by making it too proper. I always think of Boston, the band Boston. I don't know how many of you are familiar with them. They were so technically perfect. Their music was so produced that to a point it lost its beauty and it lost its emotion. That you might prefer an old blues man with a rusty old amp and a beat-up guitar making all sorts of twangy sounds to the overproduced, technically flawless music of one of the 80s super studio bands, because it has more feeling. It's not cleaner, it's not prettier, but it feels more. And that's essentially what I'm getting at with poetry, is that you need to blend your technique with your emotion, with your inspiration, and not lose one or the other. We're talking about a balance here, okay? Now, the hard question here is to know when you've gone too far. And you might think about a couple of different analogies or metaphors as a way to consider whether or not you've gone too far, okay? The first is that if you've ever tried to tune an instrument, such as a stringed instrument, and you're having difficulty finding the exact pitch that any given string should be set at, often the only way to do it, to find it, is rather than trying to micromanage the pitch when you get very close to it, is to go completely out of tune and then try to come back to it, okay? And often you can find it beautifully once you've broken the sort of closeness that you had with it. All right? This is one metaphor to keep in mind. Another example has to do with a quotation from Benjamin Franklin, who said, One who has never failed will never know his limits. And essentially, what this means is that as long as you never fail, you've never gone past the point of your ability. And so you can never know what the limit of your ability is. And the truth might be the same for poetry. Until you stretch it, until you go beyond the best it can be. And once you pass that point of the best it can be, it starts to get worse. You'll never know how good it could be because you haven't stretched it to its limit. Once it hits its limit, it breaks. So if it never breaks, if you just continue to make progress on a poem and then stop before it gets worse, you'll never know how good it could have been. Now, hopefully that makes some sense. Now, how do we revise, and how much do we revise? Well, the balance discussion just covered how much, but in terms of how to revise, there's no right way. There's no wrong way. There's no magic formula that I can give you. One thing that works very well is to begin with a point of weakness, a point where you know your poem doesn't sound right, doesn't feel like and to build it from there. There are other things to consider, though, in terms of revision, setting your mood, all right? Some revise by building lists, some revise by working on rhymes, some revise by counting and measuring and adding circles and whatnot and arrows, and some of that is old hat now that we've got computers, but maybe it shouldn't be. Some people revise first by getting themselves a drink, by picking their favorite chair or grabbing a pencil. I tend to have a pen in my hand even when I'm writing on the computer because there's something about that tangibility, that feeling of a pen in my hand that works for me. I don't want to say it makes me think better. Maybe it helps me think differently. Maybe a cookie works for you. I don't know. But you've got to find your comfort in terms of revision. And that is different for everyone. I would suggest an uncomfortable chair and a pencil, and for me, coffee. You pick your things. Maybe you need your feet up. I don't know. When I revise, I begin with the first draft of a poem, and I think nothing of what it's doing or where it's going or revision per se. I try not to write structure into my first drafts of poems. I like to write them in pen, though I've learned to compose on the screen and do most of my writing on screen now. There is, again, as I said, something about a pen in hand and a piece of paper that works for me. I'm probably about 50-50. But once I get a draft, then rather than try to decide intellectually what I want to do with the poem, I try to look at the poem and read what the poem wants me to do. Sometimes there are rhymes that happen by themselves. Sometimes there are forms that emerge, if I look carefully enough, that sort of appear on their own terms as I've written. I begin with this. I begin with the idea, or I begin with the phrase, and I let it take me as much as I can rather than taking it. And it doesn't always work, but I try not to control the techniques that get applied. I try to let them find me. That takes time, and it takes a willingness to not run the show, which is more difficult for me. I wouldn't be a teacher if I didn't like to control things, I suppose. Anyway, there are other times when I see a structure and for some reason I want something to happen, right? Or I feel that it's important for something to happen, such as a rhyme. There are plenty of times when I'm willing to let a rhyme run away and forget about it, and there are plenty of times when I feel that it's essential for a rhyme to work in a certain location, and I will work and work and work it, trying to find a word or trying to restructure a series of lines so that the words line up in the right place. And a lot of times that doesn't happen in one shot. I have poems, and I'm going to argue that the best poems I've written, and probably a lot of poets and writers would agree with me, take years to find their way. That perhaps a line of a poem written last year becomes a story this year, or becomes its own poem this year, and the previous one gets discarded completely, and it's just a line that begins what comes next. That a revision is not just a rewriting of the words that are already there, but a revision is a re-seeing, a new looking at the thing that once was. And it can take on a tremendously different form. Regardless, ultimately what I'm saying is that while you can stumble upon perfection, and you can happen onto a finished text very quickly, more than likely it requires critical distance, which means putting it away and waiting until you change. Think of when you lose your keys, and you fight and you fight and you will your way to finding your keys, and yet no matter how strong your will, they don't show up. Even though they might be sitting on the counter right in front of you, you can't see them. And what needs to happen is either you stumble upon them, which can happen in poetry too, or you need to move your mind somewhere else and allow it the time to make its own connections on its own terms, so that it can bring you back to those keys, or so that it lets your eyes work the way they're supposed to, so that you can see the keys sitting there right in front of you as they have been the whole time. If you can at all identify with this idea, then you might be able to equate it to writing poetry. Sometimes you just got to let it go and leave it be, and on its own terms. Of course, now, luckily for us, we don't make appointments with poems. Well, we might have deadlines, but if we get to the point of having deadlines for our poetry, outside of the class, that is, we're good writers, and you don't need my class anymore. So congratulations if you're there. But if you're not, other than the deadlines that I set for you, let your work have time, and never call it done, because you might go back to it and who knows what you'll find. See you later.